thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I have also had the honor to speak some of you during the past few days, and I was impressed by the amount of knowledge and expertise that's available and present here in this room and at this event. And I would like to discuss with you a topic that can make or break the future of the construction sector here in Europe, specifically the environmental product declarations. I do not know in what extent or to what extent you are familiar with this topic, so I would first like to explain to you why we need EPDs, then what exactly are they, after which we will delve into their pitfalls, and then also discuss how we can have right application of EPDs. And that's exactly where also I will give you a call to action, or more specifically a plea for awareness, because you are the key stakeholders, you are the experts on this topic. You are members of different associations in contact with the construction sector, with academia, with policymakers, so you are the ones who can influence how the future of EPDs will look like. Well, the reason why we need EPDs is because they assess the environmental impact of products that are being used in construction sectors, and an essential element of buildings consists of HVAC products, including ventilation. And to be honest, we are what we breathe. And what we breathe isn't necessarily good. It's the result of industry, of transport, of human activity, of life. Actually, even life itself is also pollen, dust, skin flakes. They all have a negative effect on the air that we're breathing. Within Europe, buildings, they are responsible for around 40% of the energy that we're using. There is a big potential in improvement because 2/3 of them have a negative energy performance. But currently, it leads to devastating effects with around 150,000 premature deaths in Europe. Also a massive GDP loss of 260 billion, not 260 billion euros annually. And also reduced energy savings, because stale and dense air is more difficult to heat in winter and more difficult to cool when it's really hot outside. So by having a good indoor air quality, you can also achieve additional energy savings. This means that we need buildings that foster comfort, well-being and health, combined with energy savings, and that's where the EPDs come into place. But what exactly are EPDs? So EPDs are the underpinnings of life cycle assessments, and EPDs, they help selecting the best products in building projects, in construction or in renovation. They are combinable because life cycle assessment consists of many different parts, so you can select the elements that you want to cover in your life cycle assessment. They are usually also third-party assessed and issued, or not usually but always, by program operators. And if you have a good EPD with a proper life cycle assessment, it takes time, it takes effort to get the proper results and the correct information. So they are also actually quite time-consuming and costly to produce. But then you also have something for it in return. They are, well, basically a life cycle on their own, in the sense that they consist of so many different stages. It goes from the early beginning of a product, from the extraction of the raw materials, up all the way to the end, the reuse, recycling, or even the disposal of products. And that leads us with 3 main groupings or main different types of life cycle assessments and EPDs that can certify them. So we have cradle to gate, that covers the production section and the end of life. Then we also have cradle to gate with options, which also you can include many different additional elements. And cradle to grave, which is covering the whole life cycle of a product. And remember that, because we will come back to that in a moment as well. EPDs are being used by basically anyone who is involved in a building project, so it can be consultants who are advising or assessing or what's the best way forward with a building project, also the owners, so that they can make a decision, and so that they also know about the value and the performance of their building. Of course, also the manufacturers, because we are the ones who are actually providing the data and making the assessment for the life cycle of the building products. There is an increased demand, so since a few years it's booming, not only due to an increased environmental awareness, but also partly because it increases the real estate value, the quality of real estate. It also enables you to make use of funding from green building programs and a green building certification and trajectories such as green, LEED, but it's also becoming mandatory in legislation, such as the new European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive mandates an environmental life cycle assessment of buildings as well. And next to that, there are also other European legislations that prescribe a similar process for the appliances that are being used in construction. Such EPDs, they continue a wealth of information on the impact of a product on global warming, on CO2 emissions, on the environmental footprint or land use footprint that they have, on the usage of minerals and resources, and in the end, it's being compiled into a scoring. Such EPDs and life cycle assessments are heavily standardized and regulated in ISO standards, in SENS standards, and also in European legislation, where you have the ISO and SENS standards setting the requirements and the composition of life cycle assessments in EPDs. You have product category rules that specify how to apply and calculate these tools for specific product groups. And then you have legislation mandating them and telling and explaining where to use them and under what conditions as well. So an EPD in standards, or at least in Europe, communicates verifiable, accurate, and non-misleading information. And please keep that in mind as well, the verifiable, accurate, and non-misleading. So now we think we have EPDs. They cover the life cycle of products that are to help making the selection of the best available product in building project. And we think we're done, we are correct, right? So there is an issue in an increasing mismatch between the objectives that we want to achieve and the tools that we're using. And that mismatch is actually at a very large risk of realizing with EPDs and life cycle assessments. So there is a very strong push from policy developers, but also from NGOs, sometimes even manufacturers who don't understand or think too lightheadedly about the impact of having an all-encompassing life cycle assessment and EPD, because they assume that they can be suitable to cover the whole life cycle assessment of products, and that cradle to grave offers all the information that you need. However, manufacturers, we are unable to make assumptions about how a product is going to be used. We can make assumptions on, or no, we can't make assumptions. We know how a product is being produced and what the environmental impact is of that. We also, well, now we can make very strong and very reasonable assumption on the end of life, reuse or disposal of a product. But it is impossible to make such assumptions on how it's being used. And how it's being solved in the use stage, when you include that in a life cycle assessment, is by including default values. And those default values, they are by definition faulty, fake, or wrong. And that's what decisions will then be made on that basis if you have EPDs including a use stage. So, in fact, to ensure verifiable, accurate, and non-misleading information, we can only go for the cradle-to-gate option, eventually with additional elements from the stages in between. So we can cover the raw materials, the transport, manufacturing, also part of the transport and the construction, and also the end of life and what goes beyond the end of life in terms of reuse and recycling potential. But what happens if we actually include the use state? So aside from having wrong and faulty information based on default criteria, we will also have a massive sub-optimization of EPDs, since it leads to a situation in which we believe that we can make the product selection on EPDs only, and that also is based partly on 3 large misconceptions, which is that there is a market reality, or that market reality will be fostered by including the use stage in it, that EPDs can be used for product comparisons, which is not the case. And then there is also a push from policy developers or from some manufacturers because they believe that it can help protecting our industry, also not really the case. And we think too lightheadedly about the administrative burden that it will place on us, not just manufacturers, but the sector as a whole, where it can actually steer the direction away from sustainability instead of actually moving towards it. When we are speaking about the first misconception, a cradle-to-gate assessment may lead to up to maybe 5% difference in outcome of a product's environmental performance, depending on the specific project. But if you're speaking about cradle-to-grave and including the use stage, depending on how a product is being used, the same product can have 5,000% difference in environmental performance, depending on where it's going to be used, in which building, in which region, in which area. And then on top of that, we will come back to the moment, you also have differences in EPD schemes, differences in life cycle assessments, and differences in the product category rules. Then if you have 2 EPDs issued by different program operators, it's not just 5,000% difference per product, depending on where it is sold, it can be much more. So in that way, EPDs, they're not standalone tools. They cannot be used as a product comparison. But you can make the life a lot easier for everyone involved if we just focus on a cradle-to-gate. It's also not usable as a tool to ensure a certain demand or to protect markets, because program operators, they also want to make money. So they also expand. And this is a screenshot, an example from a Swedish program operator who opened up shop in China. So in China, you can get also EPDs, and those EPDs, they are valid in Europe. We do not know what the quality is of the assessment in China. We do not know how it's being done, but we do know that they are having an EPD and that EPD is valid here. Speaking about that, there is a missing level playing field. So we just touched upon the point that there's a large variety of EPDs and program operators. I stopped counting them in Europe. There is a short list of what we're having, and in Europe they can be different. There is a European one, it's the eco-label, but it's voluntary. And then we also have many different national ones. Then some of those national ones, they also have a strong government involvement who then steer the direction of the criteria in a way that protects their own industry. And it's not just Europe. For example, some of you are from North America. Do you know how many there are in the US, for example? In the US, we have 12 different program operators. And just for your info, one of those program operators is heavily endorsed and has involvement from one of the governments of the European member states to facilitate and foster the industry from that one European member state. So there is also no comparability even between the EPDs themselves and the certificates behind them. And this is exactly the opposite of what Europe needs. So it is in the media now that Europe is facing a lack of competitiveness. We have geopolitical challenges. There are several wars right on our footsteps, and we also have energy and environmental transition issues. There are EU reports that we need to have a true single market. The admin burdens are too high. So what do we want? Do we want to have a prosperous economy while at the same time achieving the sustainability benefits? Then we need to keep the usage out. So how can we ensure the right application of EPDs? Well, by keeping the usage out, but that still leaves us with the impact of using the product as such, because while the usage has no place in EPDs at all, it's still an important element. It's 90% of the environmental impact of a product. We have way better ways of dealing with that. Instead of including it in EPDs and basing ourselves on faulty and fake data, we actually have tools available that are easy and relatively simple to apply, and where, with the help of the end user, we actually can put in data and can make good assumptions on how a product is actually going to be used and what their environmental impact will be. And that's described in Eurovent's recommendation on the life cycle cost of air handling unit. It's also based on life cycle assessment standards, and it considers energy demand in part loads. And more interesting, it also contains a part that gives an estimate of the cost and frequency of maintenance, repair, and replacement, which makes it a much more suitable tool than including the usage in EPDs. So what we have covered now is optimal usage of EPDs. Aligned in a harmonized market for EPDs is something that we need. And we need to calculate the usage outside of the EPDs using Eurovent's recommendation. So now, once we have that, then we will be able, maybe, to breathe fresh and good air inside buildings. I hope that I made it in time, but if I have 1 minute left, then thank you. Then this is exactly the point that I wanted to make, that I hope that for you it has now been clear why the use states need to be moved out. And I also hope that when you will go to speak with your colleagues or policymakers or other manufacturers, or if you're also a member of another association that's thinking about developing product category rules or setting up an EPD scheme for HVAC products, then that you can remind them about the complexities and the impacts of EPDs and life cycle assessments, and that also the use stage isn't, that EPDs are not the appropriate tool for having the usage included, but that we have better, more correct and easier ways of calculating them. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Presentation. Do you have any questions? Okay.
Thank you, that was very informative indeed. I wanted to ask about the embodied carbon. And I would presume that that would be one of the typical metrics that one could find on an EPD. Yeah. In fact, my experience working in the UK was that EPDs were the primary source of embodied carbon data when we're doing whole life carbon analysis. I wanted to ask about your thoughts about the quality of reporting such metrics. Can we trust them when it comes to embodied carbon? Because my experience talking to manufacturers when we're asking what is your EPD for that product, you know, it was a bit of a grey area. I'm sure there's some standardization in the background, but have you got any stories or examples to say about the quality of reporting when it comes to embodied carbon? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that in that case it really depends on the specific program itself and on what the data is based on. So if it's based on default values and on without a proper assessment, then yeah, then you can put some question marks there. But if there is a thorough assessment of where the emissions actually come from and based on an actual research or an assessment of the product, then you can have a more level of trust in the assumptions that are being made in it. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would make a statement first that EPDs, I think, is one of the most needed piece of information that we're lacking, we're missing, and hopefully we'll sooner than later move from the voluntary to the mandatory. Sometimes the market, we say, well, will actually dictate this, but I think it's kind of like, you know, if it comes down to you cannot be in the market, for example, in the EU, we control that. So surprisingly enough, for the US market, in Europe, we control that. So we can set minimum requirements that you cannot be in the European market unless you have an EPD. Maybe it will come sooner or later. But I was surprised that I was trying to understand what the problem, the issue is with the operation. When I would guess that for the industry, it would make sense that maintenance, that the years in operation, that the life time of a product, the better it is, the longer it will last, the better it is, that it would be beneficial and desirable by the industry. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Where the problem is? The lifetime, I can understand. I mean, it's kind of like, who knows what the lifetime would be? But at the end of the day, that's what we want, products that would last longer. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you are completely right. We need to have products that last long, that are repairable, and that are also made in a way that is sustainable and not too damaging for the environment. The issue with EPDs is that it's based on information provided by the manufacturer, but as manufacturers, we only have sites and we can only provide accurate and verifiable and correct information on certain stages of the life cycle. Once a product is installed and it's out of our site, we do not know how often it's being used, when it's being used, under what circumstances, for what prices, how it's being maintained, when, by whom, etc. That's out of our sight. Only the user can know that. And our issue is that if we, in the life cycle assessment, in EPDs, have to provide data for that element, then that information will be wrong, because it will be based on default data and default assumptions that we do not know. And that's why we are proposing to leave out the use stage from EPDs. So we cover the EPDs, only the elements that we know for sure we can provide the information. But for the use stage, it's still really important. It's 90% of a product's total environmental impact. But for that, we have better tools to give a more accurate result. And that's, for example, through the life cycle cost assessment that has also been developed for air handling units through Eurovent. Because that is, for us, easy to apply. We can provide the elements and the data that are necessary as a manufacturer towards that. Whereas then the user and the consultants, they can provide then, add to that the information of how it's going to be used and where and under what circumstances. And based on that, you can come up with an end result that is much closer to reality and many times more correct than basing an EPD purely on default values. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flicker. So please don't forget the Slido for the evaluation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.